The Cold Case of Questionable Conscience, from the files of BMPI. On a warm and musky day, a cramped studio apartment flared with the piercing stench of unemptied ashtrays and stale vomit. Most would have had a hard time ignoring such despondence in a residency, but since the unkempt building was quickly falling into condemnation, the infinite source of last resort tenant clientele was far too junked up and unkempt themselves to give it much negative thought. In fact, most were just glad to find refuge from the elements enough to enjoy their ever-increasing dosages of intravenous narcotics. A pair of high-priced heels could be heard growing steadily nearer, revealing the presence of what was more than obviously a fairly well-paid lady of the evening approaching. She stepped carefully over the stains that had been sequentially acquired over the decades along the hallway carpet. She made her way towards the top floor, where our hero lay slightly beyond consciousness, lounging half off of his seedy couch. The trollop knocked sweetly on the door, jolting the degenerate out of a dark and dreamless slumber.
Fucking Boyds!
He muttered as he wiped the drooled mucus from his lips and chin. Then, the knocking came again. Now realizing that it was not invasive wildlife, he stumbled to his feet once or twice before getting it right and staggered towards the intruding sound. Upon opening the door, he gained a chubby while his eyes began to focus on the most sultry woman he had seen since his last hired escort.
May I come in?
She asked meekly. He suppressed an upchuck in response and stepped aside, leaving just enough room for her to brush past. She bedazzled the room upon entry, leading the way for a potent mixed fragrance of almost enough perfume to mask the stifling scent created by the layers of dried semen that had built up upon her belly, hair, and stockings that night. She lit up a cigarette and inhaled deeply, causing a rather unattractive coughing fit. Once she regained control of her lungs, she wheezed out a small loogie that she promptly swallowed and began to plead her case.
Mr. Muttler, for years I have seen a client who has consistently paid me extravagant sums of money to distract me from the abominable acts that I am asked to perform to ease his insatiable libido. He has consistently requested the most inhumane and deplorable acts I could ever imagine, and at this time I feel he has crossed a line. Despite my standing policy of no taboo, he draws me ever closer to crossing my own boundaries. But for the exorbitant donations he grants me, I find myself capable of some of the most lurid acts. And so I am most certain that tonight when he calls, he may ask something of me I don't know if I can accomplish. I feel vulnerable, as if I may lose this steady line of employment. Therefore, I am hiring you, Barvis B. Muttler, renowned private investigator, to help me out of this most unsatisfactory predicament.
I beg your pardon,
The vaporous fumes of the detective's intoxicated breath replied,
but I wasn't listening.
He then sneezed powerfully, sending excrement flying over the elbow of his cocked arm and across the shit on his desk, spritzing the woman's face and cleavage. She exclaimed in protest of how vilely he had polluted her, then paused, realizing it was more than general knowledge that this was far from the worst of the fluids that she had had splashed onto her face while her mouth and eyes were open. She unintentionally smeared her makeup and flicked the gooey snot from her gaudy fingertips. Then, rubbing the excess slime off on the bottom of her chair cushion, she farted quietly in hopes that none had noticed, swiftly repositioning herself in a way to ensure any leakage was quickly sopped up.
I need your help, detective, and I don't know where else to turn. Although I do have enough money to hire a reputable source, I know in my heart you will do the same amount of work for much, much less. Will you help me?
The detective fished through his desk drawer and poured the ass end of a bottle down his throat and coughed, suggesting that was the kick he needed.
Look, lady, I don't really know what it is you want me to do.
It's quite simple, really. I figured even you were not too stupid to figure that out. I want you to follow and document me, then send the photos to the mayor's wife in a sealed and unmarked envelope with no instructions or explanation. I believe that should suit my needs just fine.
Why the mayor's wife?
Barvis asked, making himself appear quite stupid indeed.
Because, you idiot.
The woman hoitily answered. Barvis Pubert Muttler, private eye. He had been working those streets now for almost 30 exhausting and self-incriminating years. His old-school ways of detecting were considered obsolete by most and irrelevant by all. His belligerent nature was off-putting, and his scent drove that antisocial Nell straight home. He had dedicated so much of his life to his two-timing ex-wife that all that was left of his existing energy was spent drinking and regurgitating. All the vices in the world would not distract him from the shallow feeling he burdened himself with every time the phrase, "No man can convert a hoe into a housewife," slipped his mind. But damn it, he tried. And did he ever try? All in vain. He sat alone most nights, counting the would-be children his former lover had snuffed out and carelessly referred to as organized miscarriages. She was off now, somewhere in the dinge of that very city, fornicating men she had never met before and would not plan to see again. And for this, he had only himself to blame. Somehow, he was not worthy of that creature's attention for any longer than that of a good bang at a time. He pounded his fist as he pounded back another swallow of that sickly sweet liquor and lit up his 23rd cigarette of that day. The clock struck noon and he sunk back into his chair, thinking deeply of the life that he had planned, which never came to pass. His tears turned from sorrow to anger and then to sheer pity. Another shot. Soon the room began to spin, and that always pissed him off. Barvis shoved back his chair, cracking the drywall behind him, and standing up to the best of his ability, he cursed something not quite specific and grabbed for his car keys 2 or 3 times before wandering out towards the garage with bottles still in hand. Fierce kickback of cheap fuel wafted across the area as he fired up his 1937 POS convertible. He leaned over the door and dry-heaved a couple of times before hitting the road. The radio played a shitty old song that he hated, yet attempted to sing along to. The rusty vehicle swerved and sputtered down the road as Barvis tried desperately to remember where he was headed. After stopping at a green light for far too long, the signal cycled and he found himself making a right on red from the left lane. Cursing the pedestrian he had clipped while turning, he proceeded to fumble through his list of phone contacts to try to remember who it was he was going to visit. After running through 6 stop signs and cruising through multiple school zones at remarkable RPM, the intoxicated detective parked quite crookedly in front of the Maryton Hotel. He stepped out of his car and turned around 180 degrees to piss. Forgetting whether it was 3 or 4 shakes before considering it playing with yourself, he gave it a few extra jiggles just to be certain. Then, without zipping up all the way, he turned around too quickly, causing himself to lose balance. He picked himself up out of the puddle he had just made and headed on inside towards his most memorable assignment yet. His gooch ached as he strolled nimbly into the haven of desolage whose address he had listed in his notes. The time written illegibly was rapidly approaching. Taking a deep breath of the saturated atmosphere, Barvis now mustered up all his guts. He strode into the long, eloquent lobby and right past the cheerful desk attendant whose greeting went heard, yet unacknowledged.
Hi, who are ya?
Later that night, Alistair Potter ended his 22-year-long life, calling that ignorant patron his very last straw in the suicide note. On the 3rd floor of the hotel, the inebriated investigator sauntered along the identical doors until their sequential numerage matched the digits scribbled hastily onto his notepad. He pressed his ear against the door and heard what could only be described as a muffled barnyard-style type moaning, signaling him that this was the room as to where he was assigned to take the aforementioned pictures. Then a moment or so had passed before Barvis realized he had begun humping the doorknob. After straightening his coat, he decreed nonchalant. Inspector Muttler then carefully aimed his trusty pistol Dolores against the keyhole and unlocked the door whilst taking as many pictures as his secondary trigger finger could capture of none other than his very own parents' experimental 69th anniversary honeymoon. Oh. Although he never did finish the job for the mysterious floozy, Barvis P. Muttler, private investigator, can still be found passed out drunk and operating under his usual rates.